Welcome to Faith and Work. I'm Carol Evans, and I'm so glad you're here. This podcast was born out of a passion to help people live boldly in their faith while embracing the work you've been called to do. Whether that's a boardroom, a classroom, a kitchen, anywhere God's placed you, you carry a unique light. Right where you are, you have the power to reflect the love, hope, and compassion of Jesus Christ in a way that no one else can. Your job isn't just a job, it's a calling. In your faith, it's not separate from your work. It's woven right in the middle of it. So let's go. Let's talk faith, purpose, and let's live it out right where we are. I was 19 years old when I started volunteering at a domestic violence shelter. At first, I would just watch the kids while the moms were in counseling, and it was usually one night a week. I started doing it because it was extra credit for my public speaking class that I was so afraid I was not going to pass. My teacher, Dr. Diana Wynn, was super intimidating, and I was so afraid I wasn't going to pass that class. And lo and behold, Dr. Diana Wynn, if you ever hear this recording, and she helped me so much through that public speaking class. There are so many things that I still do today, and I'm still aware of today because of that class. But back to my volunteering. I started volunteering, I think I was between 19, maybe 20 years old. I think I was close to 19. And I did that for a while. And then after my time volunteering, they asked me if I would consider taking crisis calls. Taking crisis calls involved being on call and having a physical on-call phone after office hours, so anytime after 5 p.m., but anytime before 9 a.m. So I would get the crisis phone and I would take call. I would answer those calls. When they first asked me to do it, I was so extremely intimidated. And I remember thinking and looking at the person who asked me I'd been working with to get my volunteer hours, and I just remember thinking, there's no way I could help these women. I'm okay to watch the kids, and I would organize the supplies, I would organize the donations, but I didn't know what they had been through. I had never been where they had been. So when she asked me, my first response was, I don't think I can. I've never been through anything like that before. And she said, Carol, they don't need you to have been where they've been. They just need you to help them. And we can train you to ask the right questions. We can train you in how to help them if you're willing to learn. And so I began the process of going to classes and learning how to take crisis calls, learning what questions to ask, learning how to document things. I began taking crisis calls for several months, and then after that, I began working in the office there. It was an unbelievably rewarding opportunity. It was challenging. It was emotionally draining in a way that I had never experienced. I would leave with the biggest mix of emotions that my 20 to 21-year-old self had ever experienced before. Feeling an overwhelming sense of gratefulness for the life that I had. Feeling grateful that I had helped someone that day. And also feeling like there was still so much more to do. And the stories that I had heard were so devastating and so gut-wrenching that it was sometimes hard to walk back in the door and act like everything's okay. But there was so much of my job at that time I couldn't talk about when I got home. And it was hard. But that was the first of many times in my life that I would be tempted to believe the lie that what I could do was dependent on how old that I was. Years later, I would have a different job in a different office, and someone made the remark to me, are you even 40 yet? And I said, no. They said, well, you come back and see me after you're 40. And it wasn't even something really about work. It had to do with stress or stress management. And I remember thinking to myself, man, I cannot wait till I'm 40. And they can't hold that over my head anymore. But something else that I've learned along the way is that if I pay attention to what everyone else says about my age, I will be constantly hitting and missing a moving target. Because some people might say, man, you are just too young to volunteer there. You're too young to do that. If I listened to the lies inside of my head, I would have believed I was too young to take crisis calls. I was too young to help people with restraining orders. I was too young to be trained on how to help someone navigate domestic violence. I would be too young for this job, too old for that job. And everyone has a different idea of what too old or too young looks like. But inside of ourselves, when we think about our own behavior and our own skill, it can be really easy to look around and start comparing our lives and our status to our peers or other people in our community who are a similar age bracket than we are. When you go to fill out a form and there's a little checkbox and it says 20 to 25, 25 to 30, 30 to 35, 35 to 40, 40 to 45, 45 to 50, 50 to 60. Then the age brackets start to jump. 60 to 70, they start jumping a little bit more. No matter what age bracket you're in, God has put something in your path to do. And it can be very easy to look around and say, but they're so much further along than I am. Am I too late? Or I am too old to do something like this. If I was going to do this, it should have been in my 20s when I had a little bit more energy and a lot more sleep and before I had kids. I'm too old to do this now. But I want to take a look today at some biblical examples that we have. I've been studying the past couple of years in the Old Testament. And it's amazing when I study the Old Testament as an adult, it just reads differently. It hits differently when you see these biblical accounts of these people. When I read the story of Noah now as an adult, and I read in Genesis 6 about him being 480 years old when he started building the ark. Most Bible teachers believe that it took him between 100 and 120 years because of how the verse structure is broken up. We're not exactly sure how old he was when he started, but we do know that he was 600 years old when it began to rain. So we know that it took him between 100 and 120 years to build the ark. But as an adult, reading that story, reading that account of Noah, and imagining being 400 years old and getting this charge from God to do something that was extremely physical in his labor. I can't even imagine that. As a child and seeing it on flannel graph, that feels a little bit different. But it's not. He was 480 years old. Just a few chapters later, we see the account of Abraham. Abraham in Genesis 12, we see was 75 years old when he left his father's house. 75 years old leaving your father's house was extremely countercultural to their day. That was not normal. He left his father's house with his nephew, Lot, his family, and his wife, Sarah. At that time in Genesis 12, God promises Abraham several things. He promises Abraham that he would make his name great. He would make him a father of many nations, that by him all the families of the earth would be blessed. And he talks about making him a great nation. And we see over the next 25 years, Abraham getting this blessing and this promise at 75 years old. But it wouldn't be until Genesis chapter 17, I believe, when Abraham was 100 years old, that his son Isaac was born. 25 years in between. What fascinates me about the story of Abraham, there's many, many things. But God promised him at 75. And over the next 25 years, Abraham would make some great decisions and some not so great decisions. But God still fulfilled his promise to him. We can look also at the life of Moses. Moses was 40 years old growing up in the house of Pharaoh in Egypt. But he was 40 when he left. And then he was a shepherd wandering in the wilderness. He married Zipporah. He was a shepherd in the wilderness for 40 years. One of the most lowly and humble jobs in that culture at that time. And then at 80 years old, he goes back into Egypt. At 80 years old, he sees the burning bush. It was 80 years old when he says, God, I'm not well spoken. I don't know if I can do this. The people are not going to even believe me. I left. I'm an outsider. I was not raised with them. I'm adding a little bit to the text here, but he is saying these things to God. God, I don't know if you realize this, but I'm a shepherd. I'm out here. They're back there. No one's going to believe me. And God tells him to go anyway. God performs multiple miracles at the burning bush and says, just go. I'll provide someone for you. And he does. And then Moses, at that time, being 80 years old, goes back to Egypt, leads the children of Israel out of Egypt. You know something else I've always wondered? I was looking at some Bible maps recently. I wondered if, when Moses was leading the children of Israel out, going from one of the most lowly jobs of being a shepherd to now having this huge mantle of responsibility of leading a nation of Israel out of Egypt for 400 years. They'd been in slavery for 400 years. And now leading them out. What a huge pendulum shift. When we think of someone who's not really ready for leadership, you've led some sheep, and now you're leading an entire nation. Imagine, I cannot even fathom when we think about imposter syndrome. Think about Moses thinking, God, I am not ready. I'm not ready. Look at everyone else who could be more ready. A lot of people are more ready than I am, and God still chose him. He still called him to do it. But I wonder, as I was looking at these Bible maps recently, I wondered if some of the same places that Moses led the children of Israel through the wilderness, I wondered if they were some of the same places he led those sheep for those 40 years. I wondered if maybe he knew, hey, there's a little creek right over here, we can get some water. There's some shade. I wonder if he knew where to part in the Red Sea. I don't know. One day I'll ask him. But if you go a little bit further in the Old Testament, you will see the life of David. In the life of David, we know of him being anointed to be king as a young boy, being called in also from being a shepherd. And we don't know exactly how old he was when Samuel came to his house and anointed him to be king. Most Bible teachers believe that he would have been in his late teens or early 20s. We're not exactly sure how old he was. But it was after this call in his life, after being anointed king, that he killed Goliath. It was after being anointed king that he would fight right alongside Saul in battle. He would be a mighty man of war. He would grow to be a mighty man of war. He would marry Saul's daughter. Saul would become jealous of him, and he would start running for his life. He would have his own army and run for his life for years. He became king at 30 years old. So between the time that he was anointed until the time he became king, we think about 10-ish years. We're not exactly sure. But during that 10-year time, David wasn't ready to be king. Although he was God's anointed years before, he was not ready for that mantle. He had lots of battles to fight. He had hand-to-hand combat to go through to get ready to sit on the throne. God had a place for him. He had a calling on his life, but there was a lot of life to live between the calling and the throne. We can think about the life of Moses being put into that basket, and how many times I've seen that on flannel graph as a kid. Moses in the basket. But if we go back to before Moses was even born, we see 2 midwives who saved the babies. And their fear of God was more than their fear of Pharaoh. And that account amazes me, because if you look at that part of Moses' story, those women, those midwives, saved those babies. And the scripture says, because their fear of God was more than their fear of man. But they never saw the promise fulfilled. They obeyed God, but they never saw why. By the time Moses would have come back 80 years later, they would have long been past. But one of those babies that they saved was the baby that would come back and save the nation 80 years later. I don't know what God's called you to do. Whether He's called you to write a book or start a podcast, change career fields, take a class, go back to school, start a family. Whatever He's called you to do, if the enemy is planting any lies in your head that you are too old or you are too young to make a difference, it doesn't matter. You shouldn't do this. You're too old. You're too young. If God has put it on your heart, maybe you've prayed and asked Him to confirm it, and He has. I want to encourage you today that your age has nothing to do with God's call in your life. God's call in your life may be something that you do next week. It might be something that you do 5 years or 10 years from now. I don't know. Only you and God know that. But I hope today's episode is an encouragement to you, and this conversation is an encouragement to you that you are not too old or too young to follow God. We can look at modern business stats. The Harvard Business Review published some really interesting information when they looked at the biggest age group that started a business. The biggest age group, the highest age range of business startups, the business owners are between 40 and 49 years old. The second largest age bracket was 30 to 39, and trailing closely behind was 50 to 59. So friends, if you are in that 50 to 59 bracket, and you're sitting here thinking, there's no way I'm going to start a business at 50 years old. Why would I do that? Why would I do that? If God's called you to do it, I want to encourage you to lean into that. Paul says to the church in Thessalonica, in 1 Thessalonians 5:24, it says this. It says, "He who calls you is faithful, who also will do it." He who calls you is faithful, who also will do it. Jane Austen was 21 years old when she wrote the beloved classic, Pride and Prejudice. One of my favorite books, movies, one of the first movies Dave and I ever watched together. He says I had the pride and the prejudice. I disagree. But anyway, Harlan Sanders, otherwise known as Colonel Sanders, who started KFC, was 40 years old when he opened his first store. There are now 30,000 locations in 150 countries. Cesar Ritz opened the first 2 hotels that we now know as the Ritz-Carlton in 1898, when he was 48 years old. Mary Kay Ash started her business at 45 years old with a $5,000 investment of her own money. Mary Kay now annually posts their sales at over $2 billion. So friends, no matter how old or how young or how equipped you may feel, I want you to remember that we serve a God of David and Abraham and Noah and Moses and Paul. Remember that He who calls you is faithful, who also will do it. Your age is irrelevant to God's call on your life. Thank you so much for joining me on today's episode of Faith at Work. If today's conversation encouraged you, I would love for you to share it with a friend or a coworker. And I would love to hear what you think. So you can text me at 615-669-3209. I would love to hear your thoughts, your feedback. And if you have questions that you would like answered on a future episode, leave me your name and the city and state that you are reaching out to me from. That number again is 615-669-3209. I would love to hear your thoughts. I look forward to being with you again next week. Until then, let's keep living out our faith at work.